This video marks the final installment in my Machiavelli series, which bundles together the last 7 chapters of The Prince into one video. That might seem like a tall order, but these final chapters in particular are quite succinct. Chapter 20 deals with fortifications and arming of the citizenry. Machiavelli argues that disarming the people is a sign of weakness from the ruler, and also a sign that he does not trust his own folk. The sense in arming one subject is just taken as inherited wisdom by Machiavelli from time immemorial. He also warns against encouraging factionalism to control one's population. His reasoning for this is that fractious, disunited people will fold easily when confronted with an external enemy, although temporarily they may be more easy to manage by the elites within the society. As examples, he cites Florentine factionalism in Pisa and Venetian Guelphs and Ghibellines. Machiavelli's advice would appear to be the opposite of the stratagem currently being played out in the West, where diversity is our strength, and hostility directed towards traditional Western society seems to be the order of the day coming from Washington, D.C. and its satraps in Western Europe. Regarding the efficacy of fortifications, Machiavelli generally agrees with their use and construction, if only for their use over the centuries. All the same, he acknowledges that destroying them can at times be advantageous, citing contemporary Italian examples. Some towns which had passed between the hands of different factions and held subjects loyal to the previous regime could occupy and hold the fortresses, particularly when pressed from outside the walls, and they see a chance to parlay with the outsiders against their new masters. To deal with this internal issue, Niccolo Vitelli and Guidobaldo demolished the fortresses in their respective cities they had taken. The best fortress, Machiavelli says, is not to be hated by one's own subjects. To avoid hatred by one's subjects is to secure their respect. One of the quickest ways to gain respect from everybody, especially one's own people, is through military victories. See Chapter 21, What a Ruler Should Do to Gain Respect. He also counsels against neutrality in times of war between neighboring states, and that the prince should intervene to try and either maintain the balance of power or seek material geopolitical gain by taking one side or the other, but avoid partnering with a power stronger than himself over the weaker one, unless he absolutely must. This leaves a prince in a weak position vis-a-vis the dominant regional power, without potential allies to help him resist the regional hegemon. Other ways a ruler can gain respect is to attend meetings of guilds while courteously making his authority ever apparent, showing public displays of character when dealing with internal or external matters, and finally, by being generous to his people and affording them festivals at certain times of year, for instance. Another matter which can affect the respect in which a ruler is held is his selection of ministers, due to their direct impact on the outcomes within the realm. See Chapter 22. Great care needs to be taken when selecting these men, as their quality will reflect on the ruler's good sense or foolishness. Quoting Machiavelli's The Prince on page 123. There are actually 3 kinds of minds. One kind grasps things unaided, the second sees what another one has grasped, and the third grasps nothing and sees nothing. This first kind is extremely valuable, the second valuable, the third useless. Although Pandolfo didn't have the first kind of mind, he certainly had the second. If someone is sharp enough to recognize what's right and wrong in what another man says and does, then even if he doesn't have the creativity to make policy himself, he can still see which of his ministers' policies are positive and negative, encourage the good ones, and correct the bad." End quote. What is to be avoided in a clever minister, however, are those who think more for themselves and for the prince, where the minister's policies are designed for his own interest above the crown's. Such a person can never be trusted. One issue which is difficult to avoid, but can be helped by competent ministers, is avoiding flatterers and/or seeing through their tricks. See Machiavelli Chapter 23 on avoiding flatterers. Flattery is a difficult thing for Machiavelli because he says if a prince defends himself from flattery, he seriously risks becoming despised. The way to defend against flattery is for people to know that you don't mind them telling you the truth. However, when anyone and everyone all feel they can tell you the truth and speak openly, you lose respect. It's an indication that the people don't fear you. To get around this, Machiavelli advocates a middle way, where one's ministers, and only the ministers, are given the right to speak freely, whereupon the prince makes up his own mind and follows his own criteria after hearing their advice. Quoting Machiavelli, "A ruler must always take advice, but only when he wants it, not when others want to give it to him. In fact, he should discourage people from giving him advice unmasked. On the other hand, he should ask a great deal and listen patiently when an advisor responds truthfully. And if he realizes someone is keeping quiet out of fear, he should show his irritation." End quote. Machiavelli transitions to chapter 24, stating that if a new ruler who's taken over a state should follow his advice, he'll quickly adopt the aura of a hereditary monarch. But should a prince fail to do so, things will be difficult. Machiavelli goes on to discuss why the Italians had lost control of many of their states. He first cites their uniformly poor armies, and that some had their own people set against them or couldn't keep the nobles on side. A ruler will not lose his state provided he can field an army of his own people and avoid these failings, according to Machiavelli. This is, of course, written before the age of modern warfare, but seems sound advice at the time, and indeed today, if somewhat less true due to modern realities of warfare in the 20th and 21st centuries. For the rest of the Italian leaders who fell to outsiders and didn't make the aforementioned mistakes, Machiavelli says they got lazy off peace and failed to make preparations when the storm was brewing, and that, indeed, they often ran off when the invaders came. I'll remind the viewer here that Machiavelli had written The Prince at a time of great upheaval and outside invasion into the Italian peninsula. On chapter 25, The Role of Luck in Human Affairs and How to Defend Against It, Machiavelli writes thus on the first page of the chapter: "I realize that many people have believed, and still do believe, that the world is run by God and by fortune, and that however shrewd men may be, they can't do anything about it and have no way of protecting themselves. This attitude is more prevalent these days as a result of the huge changes witnessed, and are still witnessing every day, things that no one could have predicted. Sometimes, thinking it over, I have leaned a bit that way myself. All the same, and so as not to give up our free will, I reckon it may be true that luck decides the half of what we do, but it leaves the other half more or less to us. It's like one of those raging rivers that sometimes rise and flood the plains, tearing down trees and buildings, dragging soil from one place and dumping it down in another. Everybody runs for safety. No one can resist the rush. There's no way you can stop it. Still, the fact that the river is like this doesn't prevent us from preparing for trouble when levels are low, building banks and dikes, so that when the water rises the next time, it can be contained in a single channel, and the rush of the river in flood is not so uncontrolled and destructive." End quote. What Machiavelli is advocating here isn't so much forecasting and attempting to steer future events, but rather scenario planning, which is fairly advanced thinking for his time. The tides of the world are largely out of our control, and a ruler cannot forecast and engineer every eventuality, but what he can do is predict likely scenarios, both good and bad, prepare for the worst, and be more prepared when fortune swings one way or the other, and be thus not caught totally unawares or unprepared when the metaphorical dam breaks. This leads us to the 26th and final chapter of The Prince, an appeal to conquer Italy and free it from foreign occupation. In this final chapter, Machiavelli makes his final pitch to Lorenzo de' Medici. His ask is to attempt unifying Italy under one Medici crown and driving out the Spanish and French invaders at the same time. This is the culmination and purpose of his advice within The Prince, in addition to serving as a resume and gilded work request to work for the Medici family on Machiavelli's part. The Italian unification Machiavelli hopes to see is still centuries away from reality. Yet, he is correct that, eventually, it is unification of Italy and the formation of a competent citizen army that was able to be the guarantor of its independence on the international stage. Of course, this means that local republics and principalities within Italy itself would have to bend the knee to a singular sovereign at the head of a unified Italian state. Yet the future fate of Italy and Europe, generally speaking, was one of national consolidation, nationalism as an ideology, and the military pivot from an aristocratic knightly caste and reliance on mercenaries to the construction of ever more powerful and uniform national armies who owed their allegiance to the nation state. And although Machiavelli's timing in hoping for such an event was off the mark, he proved to be prophetic and correct about the general course of history that would lead Italy to independence under a singular sovereign prince, while providing within this work realist analysis and prescriptions for how to gain and maintain power within this fallen world. This concludes my series on The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. It's been a long work in the making, but I'm glad to have finally put this to rest and brought this to completion. Special thanks to my backers for supporting this work, including Burnham's Ghost, Count Elmsley, Symbols, JNS 77, Fresno Pharmacist, The Prudentialist, Skeptical Waves, Nevermore Night, Winter Phoenix, Forrest Kieran, Holophonist, GC Mitt, and Hominid Ape. If you'd like to become a member, please consider becoming a backer on Subscribestar, like the aforementioned fine gentleman, for as little as $2 a month. We're only $20 away from reaching our goal, at which point I'll create 2 exclusive pieces of content for all backers only. Any and all support is greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Patriarch out.